Good morning, everyone. We are about to start our roundtable today. First of all, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Just a quick overview of like some housekeepings. I'll just ask everybody to remain muted. And as you have questions that you'd like to ask, you just enter them on the chat box. We will be monitoring it and bringing those questions to the roundtable as well. I'll just be looking at that part, and also someone else is helping me to keep track on that part. We will be recording this section, so you're going to have that recording available later on. Mrs. Steele will be sending tomorrow for everybody if you would like to rewatch or have additional questions that you'd like to catch up with. And we just a couple of reminders. We will also be making a couple of surveys available at the end of this this hour. That we would like your input on those surveys. And also we have a field day coming up in April 11th in Varnville. So we'll be also advertising how to register for that later on. So I just want to take a minute to introduce everybody that's going to be on this roundtable today. So I'll start with Dr. John Fike. He's a professor and extension specialist at Virginia Tech. Dr. Fike has been working with Silvopasture for some time, and he was also on the webinar last week. He gave a webinar about some general overview of Silvopasture Systems, and he has been working with silvopastures there in several research trials, establishment, management practices, a lot of good information that is really good to have him on this roundtable today. Then we also have Dr. Miguel Castillo. Dr. Castillo is an associate professor and extension specialist at North Carolina State University. And Dr. Castillo has also been involved with research in silvopasture system, both in North Carolina and also in Peru. So he's going to be sharing some of the insights and some information that he also has with us. Then we also have Mrs. Janet Steele. She's a forestry and wildlife extension agent with Clemson University. She has been involved with some clientele of hers that has been establishing silvopasture systems here. So it's really good to have her input as well. And also we have here on the roundtable Mr. Alton Smith. Mr. Smith is the owner and manager at Smith Forest Management here in South Carolina. He lives in Varnville and has been using silvopasture there since 2017. And he has some stands in different ages currently. And that is we're going to be having the field day on his property in April. So this is really good that we were able to get this roundtable together. So just as a reminder for those that join a little later, I ask you all to remain muted, but please enter your questions on the chat box as we go. We will be welcoming them. And just to get started, I'll be asking some questions here, and you all can provide some additional questions to those topics or other topics that you'd like me to ask. So I'll start with Dr. Fike and Dr. Castillo. So I think it would be good for us to start perhaps with a general definition for those that are not as familiar with what silvopasture systems are. So could you just briefly talk about like the major components of silvopasture systems, or even like the types of setups that we can have?
You want to start, Miguel?
Sure, yeah. So, when we think about silvopastures, and the way we should probably think about silvopastures is that they are a type of agroforestry system, right? So agroforestry is the big umbrella. Now, within agroforestry types, we have a silvopasture, which is, we call it the intentional integration and management of three components mainly. So there's the forage component, there's the livestock component, and then there is the tree component, right? So, and I've heard this from Dr. Fike several times, silvopasture is not letting the livestock loose in the woods, right? Not letting livestock do whatever they want to do in the woods. And I would agree with that. Now, within the framework of that silvopasture, there can be quite a bit of variability in terms of the design of the silvopasture. There's not a single design of how the trees should be arranged. In terms of the type of livestock that it's used, silvopasture is not exclusive to beef animals necessarily, right? You can have small ruminants, you can have dairy animals, and also the types of forages, right? It's not limited to a given type of forage. And I mention this because for a given situation, even within the same region, even in the same neighborhood, two neighbors may have two different goals out of managing forages, livestock, and trees. One may, for example, wanted to maximize the livestock response. Another one may have a different reason why he uses the silvopasture. Maybe he needs to design his silvopasture to manage a little bit of the environment. He wants to take advantage of the shade that the trees could provide to the grazing livestock. In this part of the world would be summer months, right? If you're in a different part of the world, then that changes. And we also the type of forage that it's planted. So I guess I will leave it there, and Dr. Pike wants to add.
Yeah, I guess I would say I think that was all well and good. I think where we can take advantage of beneficial interactions or manage competition in these situations, that's you'll often hear the 4I principle tossed about, that it's intentional and interactive and integrated and whatever the fourth I is right now, but intensive. And that's probably the point that I should always remember the most, because these systems are not really for people who are not willing to manage. I'll just leave it at that. It's going to take a lot of extra, or it's going to take a lot of effort beyond what would, what many livestock producers are willing to do in order to make these systems, viable. And I would agree with Miguel that, how they're managed may be quite different from one farm to the next. He mentioned only ruminants. There are people that are working with monogastrics, so pigs and even chickens in some cases. Tree Range is the name of a company that does silvopastured poultry in parts north of here. The one thought about managing interactions that I would touch on, and this gets back to forage species and that sort of thing. So when we're thinking about these systems, we have to think about what are the resources on the site. And it gets very hard to be prescriptive. If you're looking to grow corn or soybeans or some other kind of row crop commodity, we have kind of generalized recipes about what you need to do for that in terms of managing soils and soil fertility and timing of planting, etc. It's much more, the choices are perhaps much more robust or in a silvopasture system where you could be growing pines or hardwoods. If you've got a stand that you're going to thin, you have to make appropriate thinning decisions to leave those trees and have decent forest health. At any rate, when we think about putting these systems together, as you go further south, it gets warmer. You're more likely to see some warm season species in the understory. My part of the world, probably upland South Carolina and western parts of North Carolina, that sort of thing. Cool season grasses are not uncommon, and those plants can take advantage of that kind of moderated environment where shade is kind of I would just call it a moderate level of shade, because they don't need full sun. But if you're in places, or if you're trying to grow a warm season grass, You need to think about providing adequate light and even heat units in some respects for those warm season grasses to do well. And so you can manage some of that with tree spatial arrangement, that sort of thing. So there's lots of different ways to put these systems together. And that's kind of both the beauty and the complexity of it.
And when we are thinking, so you mentioned some points, and I'll go to Janet in a second about the thinning aspect and those parts, but you touched some points about the configurations that you can have with those systems. But I was wondering, like, what are some of the other considerations that we need to do when we're selecting a site? So, like, what about the soil part, or like, are there other things that we need to think about when we're going to consider the forages establishment for those areas that producers might need to think ahead of time?
Well, so I guess it kind of depends on how you're starting, right? If you're doing some kind of thinning, most likely in a forested stand or even a pine plantation, you're likely to have low pH, perhaps low fertility soils. So if you want to have a decent forage stand with decent productivity, in many cases, you may need to put inputs of nutrients and limestone into those systems to change pH and nutrient availability. Maybe you don't want to do it that way. So maybe you decide to come back with native grasses that are much more tolerant and productive in situations where soil pH and nutrients are more limiting for, say, cool season forage production. If you are taking a pasture and going ahead and planting trees back in that, those trees are often, well, it's going to depend on what species you go with as to how well suited they'll be to the environments of that pasture. Is that land, is it kind of played out? Or I shouldn't say played out, but perhaps it's received less tender loving care than it should have received. In that kind of case, that may work well for tree establishment. And maybe you want to just kind of, let's say you wanted to plant in rows, you might keep bands of the field unfertilized so that the trees have an opportunity to get established with less forage competition. But you might still need to bring those areas where you're growing forages back into a better soil nutrient status for more productivity. Trees, obviously, so an old forester once told me, said, you can grow almost any tree, almost anywhere for a certain period of time. And, he was making that comment for people who would plant redwoods in Virginia. They're not adapted here. They might grow here for a little bit. And then the people say, well, why did my redwood tree die? Well, because it's not from here. It's not suited to here. So if you've got a wetland site, probably you think about things like walnuts, perhaps, if it's not too wet. Cherry bark oak is not a bad one for wet sites. There are a number of other species. Willow, when it's maybe a little bit warmer, cooler climate, might be suited. Bald cypress is an excellent tree for wetland sites. So you have to think of, or I shouldn't say wetland sites. I'll just say for soils that have, are a little bit more moist at times. But you have to think about what is the suitability of the tree to the site where I want to set up this silvopasture. And so there are all those kind of standard pieces. Let me back up and just say one thing. Because the systems are complex, and because people are often working across more disciplinary areas than they've ever studied, you might be a forester, you might be a darn good forester. That doesn't mean you know anything about forages or livestock, or the other way around, whatever. So our recommendation is always work as a team wherever you can, so that you have good advice about what makes good site selection decisions relative to tree species or forages and that sort of thing. And how's that whole piece going to work? And I would proffer as well, if you're going to set one of these up from scratch, part of that team needs to be any operation that conducts business on your property. For example, if you're gonna, you routinely use inputs from the co-op, and they say, well, we'll come in and spray this or that for you to get this established. You don't want to put trees in with a 50-foot alley and they've got a 100-foot boom. That's just not a good recipe. So you want to find people that are working with you. You want to engage them in this process.
Mhm.
And I've spoken too much. Take it, Miguel.
So I'll add a few things relative to the trees too. Is the orientation at which you
Mhm.
plant those trees. If you're looking at rows, for example, just think about how the sun comes up and down and what type of shade, depending on the distance or the arrangement of those trees, you will be giving to the forage, for example. It's kind of similar. You can think about this the way when you're building your house. What's going to be the orientation of that house relative to where the sun comes? Now, in this case, if we wanted to maximize sunlight for the forages that are growing, right? So that it's one orientation. Then relative to forages, I would add that just like trees, there are some forages that, in general, my take is that grasslands forages tend to grow much better in poor soils than crops, right? And that has been our experience here. Also, maybe corn, soybeans don't grow really well here, but boy, that's a really good pasture. Now, in those pastures, for example, we have also experienced situations where it's not only the drought, but it's the flood. We have actually lost a few pesky pastures that were underwater for a week, and we actually saw native grasses that survived that same flooding in the exact same site. So you
Mhm.
have to think about the topography of your land too, right? Maybe you are able to plant some type of forages in one area and others in another area, depending on how big your system is. Or maybe you just have to make the decision of a single type of forage, and then you probably select that considering these other factors, the orientation of trees, the shade that they're going to provide, the flooding and the drought of those in those areas, the topography, right? So wanted to add that to the conversation.
Mhm. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. So, Janet, I want to just go back to that part that they were talking about. So, like, we can have we can have different ways to establish silvopasture. So, one of the ways is when you have established forestry stand, and then you need to make some decisions on how to think and like what considerations you need to make about selecting those trees. So could you please provide some input on that sense? And also like who would be the people that we should be seeking advice from usually in terms of like the dance or which trees to select to remove from those areas?
Sure. So here in South Carolina, most of our established pine stands, you're going to expect your first thinning, depending on the species, anywhere from 12 to 15 years of age. And traditionally, that's a third or fourth row thin. So they're going to have, and it's operator select. So the guy running the feller buncher is going to take out an entire row and then kind of thin within the residual rows to remove any low quality stems or diseased. So when that's done, you're left with just a gap, of a row. So if you were doing this and you did want to go ahead and look at getting those forages established earlier, you could go ahead, instead of having them remove just one row, take out enough rows to create a larger alley. So where you could start getting those forages established. If you're looking, you've already thinned once, then that second thinning is when you really probably need to get a professional forester, and Alton will have a better explanation of this, but to mark those trees you want to take out, because you don't want to sacrifice the quality of that timber stand. That's another source of income for your property. So you need to have somebody who knows how to mark, leave the best trees, take out the lower quality trees for that second thinning and subsequent thinnings to start opening it up. But it's hard if you have, a stand. You can't just jump in there and take out half the trees to start with. You're going to end up with a lot of issues with exposing those residual stems to breakage if we have ice storms, have wind storms. So either gradually opening it up through subsequent thinnings, or when you do that first thinning, taking out some additional rows to create those forage alleys. But Alton, I know he took an existing stand and then thinned it and established forages. So he would be a great one to discuss that.
Absolutely. Oh, do you wanna say anything?
Yeah, I can. What I did on my first thinning was just did a basic standard first thinning on mine, and that's kind of where I started with this. I went and just planted my takeout rows to start with, and had good survival. And I just scattered on top and let the rain put it in the dirt the first time because I didn't have fences. I couldn't put cows or anything in there, and it really did well. So I went back and planted in between the existing rows. I had a herd spreader on the back of a four-wheeler is how I spread all the seed. And the cows, I put cows on at that time. They walked it in with rain and got a good survival. The key to the thinning is to make sure you thin the trees to leave your best quality, but at the same time, you're leaving enough trees that you actually have to be able to manage and come back for. You can thin these things down too thin and not be able to get a logger back in. Another thing with that is think about your fences and stuff that a logger will be able to get in and work around. I know I've fenced off a block or two myself that when I get ready to cut again, I'm gonna have to take down the fence to get loggers back to it. But the key is to make sure with the thinning that it's done the right way. Another problem a lot in the low country was planted in CRP about 97, 98. There are these old fields that are perfect for putting in silvopasture, but you also get a notice root rot. So you have to be very careful with your soil disturbance. And you say you got a takeout row you could plant, but you still got a row of stumps down the center of that takeout row. So it's not like you can just jump in there with a drill and plant it. But, that's kind of the highlights I got.
This is a really good point that you brought up because I was actually having this conversation about removing the stumps with two different people last week, like trying to really come up with what would be the best way. Because usually if you're going to, if you have time and you just plant the forages, some people choose to just let the stumps rot after some time and kind of like incorporate themselves. But if you're really trying to get that stand established as soon as possible and you have livestock, grinding that would really be ideal, right? To like really having that incorporated in the area before. I want to really get a little more information about both of you, Janet, and you all are welcome to just stay unmuted from the roundtable. I want to get more input about like what are some people might be establishing the trees on a well-established forages stand. So I have no experience with forestry, so that's the reason that, and I don't know how silly this is gonna sound, but like, what are the management that we would need to do for the trees? Like, are there fertility requirements that we should be thinking about, pruning that will occur during that period, just to give us some general idea about what would be the management on those trees, either on stands that are tree stands that are already established, or if they were to plant the trees into the established forages stands.
Well, the most important thing, if you have an established hay pasture or hayfield or pasture, is you've got to get that competition controlled to give those seedlings the chance to survive. So we can do that either with herbicides, so band spraying to establish those rows you're going to plant the trees in. There's some mechanical methods you can use, like scalping, that actually peel back the that forage layer to get the seedlings some open ground to grow in. But the main thing is you've got to get the competition from those grasses under control, especially with longleaf pine, because it does spend some time in that grass stage, and so it's going to take a year or two to really jump up. And once those seedlings are in the ground, especially with longleaf, you're more limited in what herbicides you can spray around them to control those grasses. So as far as establishing, those would be just some things to think about. As the stand matures, you're going to be looking at, if you are doing pruning, we have a lot of good genetics now where those pine for loblolly seedlings have fewer branches. They're breeding them specifically to have clearer stems. So that would be something to consider also, is look at what genetics you're going to use when you put in that stand, and maybe spend a little bit more money on those better seedlings to get a variety that is not quite as limby as some of the other ones. And then also with any of the mechanical practices, like if you do need to scalp, or if you need to rip, if you need to subsoil, if it's an old ag field, make sure you do that along the contour of the property and not up and down, where you're creating actually a furrow that's going to carry water across the site. So those are kind of a couple of things I've thought about, and then I'm sure Alton's got a few more suggestions.
One thing, when you plant into the new fields, you're not gonna be able to run cows on it for a few years, because they do like the new growth. They will eat and mess up your seedlings. Had it happen on several tracks with cows getting out. So I imagine if you put them out there in the middle of it, the grass gets low, they would take care of your new seedlings for you.
So Alton, I wanted to follow up on that. Because we have some research site stuff, and I think, you know, the livestock species, livestock class, those are, again, some of these interactions that you need to consider when you're setting these things up and managing them. As an example, I had a NRCS technical service provider from Alabama send me some stuff one time, and he had pictures. You know, cows were among the pines that he had, no problem, but then he had a bull that decided it needed a belly scratch, and so it just walked down a 4-inch tree. You know, just wanted to get that scratch in. And so with what we've done on the research station, where we've had stockers, they might damage the pines a little bit, but these are loblollies, but really not a whole lot. And I've seen some old data from probably the late 60s, early 70s, where they were plantation number of trees. They just brought the cow herd in, and they just felt like the losses of individual trees or damage to trees was not enough to justify trying to do any sort of protective functions. And then, you know, in time that would become a pine plantation. So I guess that's a lot of preamble to ask the question: do you think you could manage a pine stand if you accounted for new growth and kept livestock out when you had new growth on those pine needles?
You might could. I never tried it that way. I just know that they will eat it when it's got the new growth on. I have seen the damage in the past, but it could be that you let the tree come out and harden off a little bit, and then you could dump cows back in there with it and be fine. Haven't done it, didn't want to take the chance.
Yeah. Well, and so, you know, that might be something to test on a corner of a silvopasture area that you got planned, but not on the whole thing. But so that brings me back to this point that management is critical, and there's a lots of different ways to do things, as my great grandma used to say. Not all of them are good, but you can probably, you know, figure out on your land, your system, what works and what doesn't work, and do it without, you know, taking a haircut in the process.
Mm-hmm. And on
So
that,
maybe
sorry, go ahead, Miguel.
I was just going to share with you some of our experience here in North Carolina, southeast part of North Carolina. So with pines, and it's also cherry bark oak. It took us about 7 years after the pines and the cherry bark oaks were planted to be able to, that we felt comfortable putting steers to graze those paddocks, so that even just the physical rubbing from the animals to the trees wouldn't take down those trees. Now, those 7 years were in part, combination here was 4 years that we had that land in annual cropping, but then we actually planted native warm season grasses. It took us more than we would have wanted, but that was the nature over here. It took us 2 years to actually feel comfortable with the stand of the grass to be able to put the livestock to graze. So after 7 years of growing those trees and 2.5 years of the native grasses, we felt comfortable that, okay, now we can put livestock into and we were not fencing out or in the trees. We were letting the livestock walk through the lines of trees. So we felt comfortable that, okay, we can now put livestock to graze. Now, can we lower it down 1 or 2 years? I don't know, maybe. But, you know, our rationale in part was that we had these very nicely designed rows of trees that we didn't want to lose any trees. So we wanted to wait to make sure that the trees grew, were tall enough, wide enough to be able to withstand any potential damage from the grazing livestock.
So I'm going to follow up on that because we did a survey in Virginia a few years ago. This is a Wilkins et al. Publication, if you're inclined to read that kind of stuff. And the interview was for like 300 producers or so that got the survey. I shouldn't say interview, but 300 got a survey. And they looked at planting trees or thinning trees, the opportunities with either of those contexts or the constraints. And the big constraint for planting trees for most respondents, I say most, almost half of the respondents said, forfeiting pasture is a constraint that we don't want to countenance. In fact, many people would say, we're interested in thinning woodland stands in order to expand our grazable acreage. So the producers that I've worked with in Virginia that are planting into pasture, they're not walking away from that or not taking their cattle away from that. They're putting up fencing, temporary, electric sort of stuff to keep livestock off the tree row. And, some would even go so far as to, I sprayed out a band or to get the trees established. Then I might come back with something like a legume and set the electric fence high enough that small calves can get under and kind of graze around that. Others are just, they're just kind of leaving that area sort of semi-managed. They might take the fence down and do a little clipping in there every once in a while or bring in some younger stock that they felt would not push on the trees, but they are loath to give up grazing land. And so they're using other approaches to that. And last week I showed a farmer who was actually building the fencing into building the protection into the fencing or the fencing into the protection, either way you want to say that, so that their trees were not being affected and they were not losing pasture land.
So I remember with the pipes as well and the electric fence that you showed. So I want to take a moment now to get a little more into Alton's experience so far. Because I always think that's a good idea to bring like the producer perspective, but I'll be asking some questions, Charlotte, but you all feel free to also share your experience, because I know both Miguel and John has been working with producers and also Janet for years, so you might have some input on that as well. But Alton, could you please just share a little bit about like why did you decide to start using silvopastures and how long you have been using them there on your property?
Gotcha. The reason why I decided to start, I first got out of college and we had some cows on the farm, but I wanted my own herd, but open land was kind of limited between what family already had and what was available around me. And we had a fair amount of open land that went into trees in '97 in the CRP program, and all that was coming due to be thinned. And I'd go to all these tracts that had been in pastures that had been put in trees, and they still had grass around the edges where they had sunlight. And so I just kind of started out small, just trying to see if it would work, and started getting decent success. So I just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger into it till I got around 80 acres in it now, and have been doing it. The first little bit that I started trying was in 15. I went full scale in 17, planting a fair amount and putting fence up and actually putting cows into woods. But it's like anything else. The more you manage it, the better results you're gonna have out of it. I started out just kind of planting grass and letting it do what it would do, with a little bit of urea or something on top. But now it's getting full scale fertilizer, lime, the whole 9 yards to make it be as productive as it can be. And my cows they used to stand at the gate wanting to get back in the field when you put them in there, and now they stand at the gate wanting to get back in the woods if you try to lock them out. So your cows have to get used to it. You have to get used to it. Just the handling of it, checking your cows, the whole 9 yards is getting used to it. So my recommendation would be just start real small and work your way into it.
And what were some of like your major challenges when you were starting off?
Some of my major challenges was my mindset. I'm used to a field. I could go out there and spray the field. I can spread fertilizer on it, and I've got a pretty crop. And the woods doesn't work that way. Access isn't there. You have stumps and limbs and dead trees and everything else in your way constantly. And the seed isn't too cheap to go throw on top of the dirt and look at it. And, you know, the older generation looks at you and says, well, you just threw that away. And you had not. But it took some time and some trial. I had to do a lot of prescribed burning first. That's how I kind of prepared all my seed bed, was I would burn it and then just put seed on top right before rain and put cows on top of that and let them walk it in. But it's just a totally different mindset from a field, and you're not going to have the results of a field. You can have the same amount of forage in the woods, but you're going to have a bare area here or a better area over here, and it'll get better over time, but just don't, it's going to take time. Don't expect it to happen overnight.
Mm-hmm. And just to share with everybody here, so you have your perennial grass is Bahia grass, right? On the majority
I
of
have
the
59
land.
on most of mine. And then I
And
do
then-
winter grazing of oats and ryegrass.
I was going to ask you to share that as well, because you usually oversee that area, so you can try to extend the grazing days, right? So this
That's
is
right.
is
And
something-
one thing with the 59 underneath the trees, you know, you get your first frost, your field's done. Well, the trees actually shade some of that frost off, so you get a couple more weeks out of the 59 before the frost actually gets underneath there and kills them off. One problem I got with a lot of mine is the canopies are closing back up because it's just had a traditional first thinning on it. No extra's been taken out. I'm still running about 140 trees an acre right now, and it's due for a second thinning now. But the winter grazing is still doing excellent. Last summer I didn't quite have as much out of the Tifton in there that I wanted, but it just needs some more sunlight. Is all it is.
Mm-hmm. And from your experience so far, if you had to share one piece of advice for somebody considering to establish a silvopasture, what would you say?
Try it. Definitely try it.
That's a good one.
It's not for everybody. I'll be honest with you. Some people might not like it because it's not going to look perfect. But if you give it a few years and stick with it, it'll turn your woods into something beautiful. And at the same time, you're growing trees, you're growing cows. And I finish all my calves out in the silvopasture because they eat no matter what. If it's 100 degrees, they're eating. And that's where I want mine to be. So,
Alton, that was beautiful. No,
I don't know about that. I've just been trying and going.
No. Because yeah, we get stuck in a mindset. We have a paradigm. You know, this is what so and so did. Grandpa, great grandpa always did, and I don't believe that. But so one of the planters that I know that's very big in silvopasture establishment, he says you should take the 10 tree challenge. You know, if in terms of putting trees back into a system, and just try a couple different species, different protections, whatever, but just take the 10 tree challenge and learn. You don't need the 10 acre failure. The 10 tree challenge will get you started, and then you kind of work your way into it. It's a great story. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Do you know if you have like neighbors or some other people around that start doing silvopasture, or you even helped them after you started there, Alton?
I've seen a few more trying now. I know there was some few in a couple bordering counties. Mr. Bob Franklin's on here. I think he'd helped them years ago put some in. But what we had was a lot of woodland grazing. Everybody just turned the cows in the woods, and whatever they found, they ate. But actually, as far as planting it, putting fertilizer on it, managing it, doing rotational grazing, I don't know of many more right around me, but there's a lot talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Alton, do you see, I mean, maybe, I don't know if you're in position to see it, but do you see any differences in tree growth where you're putting fertility back into these systems, you know, whether directly from fertilizer or just from the livestock itself? Can you tell?
I am. Trees are growing better because they're getting extra nutrients. At the same time, I'm not losing any with cows underneath them and all that good stuff, you know, around them. And that's one thing with mine is I've kept my tree stocks like a normal plantation would be. I haven't reduced any. So the timber side hasn't given up any, where I'm still making 100% on the timber and I'm grazing cows underneath it. And most of the time, what I have read in it is they both should be about 3/4 to 80% somewhere in there efficient. But on my case, I haven't given up on the timber side yet. I'm still doing decent with the cows.
Mm-hmm.
Alton, if I may ask this question, because this is I don't think there's a single answer to this. It's probably a very difficult question, and I would just like to hear your perspective. what do you think long term for your system? Are you going to keep thinning trees down? How many years down the road? What's going to be? You're going to get to a point where you may say, okay, do I have enough trees or not? What's your goal here?
That's what you got to do with the timber management side. When the trees get mature, you're gonna have to take them out and start to crop over. And that's kind of one of the lingering questions I have when it gets maturity and I take them out is, do I leave it open land pasture or do I plant trees back? And what am I gonna do with the cows in a couple of years? I mean, because I'm serious, if I plant them, I doubt I could dump cows in there the first year or two till I get the terminal bud to where they can't bite it out of the tree.
So it sounds like probably in your case, then, you started with trees that you're thinning out, but some years down the road, now you're going to have to put trees back into the system, and that will be a full cycle kind of thing. So that's
right.
interesting. Yeah.
That's coming. I mean, a tree has a life expectancy like anything else, and if you're gonna get the maximum amount out of it, you've got to harvest it.
Absolutely. So, Alton, you mentioned that you included burning at some point to sort of like have the seeds planted. So I don't know, whoever at this point, whoever wants to just time in about that side of like using burning as a recommended practice on silvopasture sites, and whether you want to talk a little more about like how to use that for from the standpoint of when you're using native worm season grasses, for those of you that have experience already with that, or other species. But I just wanted to get some thoughts on that direction.
I use my burning mainly as a site prep. We had to reduce the fuel load to get me an open seed bed to where I could plant. The first couple of years before I introduced the winter grazing in there, I still burn every year on it. That would bring back my competition and help my grass put out a little bit earlier. But now, being that I've got a winter grazing in there's green, you don't want to burn it up. I have started the last 2 years leaving one of my blocks out, not planting any winter grazing in it, so I can get a control burn just to help with the fuel layer from the trees and that type stuff.
Liliane, I just wanted to bring your attention. There's one question in the chat. It says for
Okay.
Alton, what's your
Yeah.
stocking rate, acres per cow kind of thing? If you could tell the audience, please.
Right now, I'm running about 2 acres to 1 cow. Like I said, I've got some extra grass in places that I can rotate cows out into and back into the woods. But I hated all this past winter. We had good rainfall, so I kept them in the woods the whole summer. And like I said, they've been in the woods all winter. So.
And were you I know, like from the research standpoint, some of these two researchers, they have done some research on this side in terms of like animal performance responses. But I was wondering if you were able to see some difference maybe on gain, autumn, or even like on the body score of these animals over. We have summers here that usually we end up having heat index for several days over 100 in July and August. So I was wondering, like, your perception, visual or whatever type of perception you were able to have in comparison, if you notice some difference.
Yes, that's the reason why I said I try to finish all my calves when I wean them out in the woods, just because they'll eat all day long. I can have some in the field right here by it, and they underneath the shade tree laid down 3/4 of the day and eating late in the afternoon and early in the morning. And the ones in the woods are walking around eating all day long because they're in the shade and they're cooler. A black cow in low country South Carolina gets hot in a hurry.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why I think they like the shade that much more. Like I say, mine used to, they wanted to get back in the field when I first put them in the woods. And now if you lock them in the field, they stand at the gate and holler and want them to get back in the woods. I mean, that's just where they see home. I mean, one clap of thunder or a little bit of rain or wind, they're headed to the woods if you have them out in the field and they can get back in.
Don't know if anybody else has any additional inputs.
So Alton's experience is a little different than ours. We've seen some old data from Arkansas and some of our with cows. Our data with sheep would suggest that, yeah, they do graze, and having those trees distributed allows them to graze in a distributed fashion, which is good. But the energy sparing in those systems, from what we've seen, is they actually spend more time lying down. And if they're lying down chewing their cud, that's a good thing. The sheep, particularly, they'll go out in the open, they'll go stand, put their heads under each other's belly, trying to use each other as an umbrella, I guess, or a parasol, and that doesn't work too well. So they're all crowded up and unhappy.
Mhm.
I wanted to add that we did an exercise. We look at the weather data, 30 years records from stations, and we calculated what's called the thermal heat index. Some people
Mhm.
tend to use that to refer to stress in livestock. When the thermal heat index is greater than 72, and I believe that's also in the USDA publications, then there's risk for heat stress for livestock. And so we look at the whole US map, and in our region, mainly south part of North Carolina, certainly South Carolina and going south, uh, we may have around 100 days in the year where the thermal heat index could be greater than 72, right?
Mhm.
The more south we are, the greater the value. So that's about a third of the year. And of course, we know that's going to be the summer months,
Mhm.
where that thermal heat index value could be greater than 72. Now, the thermal heat index, it's calculated based on temperature and humidity. But the other great advantage that I see using the trees is that they serve as an umbrella, right? So the sunlight, the radiant heat, is not going directly to the skin.
Mhm.
And so that's the other great benefit of having these trees. That if one of your goals is to mitigate a little bit of the heat stress in the summer, then you will also start thinking, what type of tree canopy do I need in order to select trees for the system that I'm trying to run? Again, it just depends on what your goals would be.
And that's an important point, not only for the animals, right, Miguel, for the forages as well, because when you have that canopy over, we would be having some level of reduction of the forage production, right? So definitely something to think about as well. So I don't know how long this question is gonna take, so I'm just gonna ask them, and I really want to get everybody's input on this now. So, do you think silvopasture can be profitable and sustainable option in the Southeast?
From a producer side, yes. It's not perfect, but at the same time, you're utilizing land for two crops. Basically, you're growing trees on it, and you're growing cows or whatever, or it could be grazing. I mean, you're growing a lot more out of your land. You're utilizing your land to maximum potential, I feel like.
And I would not argue with Alton at all. I think there is kind of an it depends, and you hate to hear that from professors, but that's what we like to say, right? But there is an it depends kind of component here. So as an example, we have a producer that thinned, and maybe I mentioned this last week. He thinned a hardwood stand, and at first things were looking good, but those trees really were stressed by the process, and it didn't help the trees or the forest health very much. But two things, I mean, he got what he wanted in terms of shade for his livestock, and as far as tree value, it didn't matter to him because his trees are going to end up in a railroad tie market. So it didn't change the equation for him. Now, if you're looking for, decent value timber crop that could go to cabinetry or whatever, no, that wouldn't have worked unless they were looking for some sort of distressed wood for that. Just another example, George Owens, some of you will have heard that name from Chipley, Florida. George was managing pine trees for the veneer market. My understanding is that was working really well for him until the veneer plant closed. So, I mean, some of these things you don't control, right? And that's going to have a real impact on your economic outcomes. But from my perspective, the Southeast is a great market for timber, particularly yellow pine. And I think there are real opportunities. And a lot of these lands are not real well managed in terms of the pine plantation. And so there may be opportunities to access those lands at low lease rates, clean them up, bring livestock in, and get value from them from the livestock perspective at a very low rate without having to worry about the tree side of it so much. If you've got a cooperating landowner, and if you can buy it for not that much, then that's even all the better. Somebody says here, our loblolly harvest last year got a really low price, right? So, I mean, that's one of the challenges of talking about short-term crops and long-term crops and trying to understand the economics of them, because, you know, maybe you have a pandemic and then the markets crash and you don't have any control over that, right? 30 years ago, you thought you were going to be sitting in tall cotton and suddenly it's not. So, but that's kind of part of the challenge. But we have that problem with on an annual basis with commodities too. So.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I wanted to add a little bit about especially for this group that it's interested also in having the livestock there. It appears that, you know, to the best of our knowledge, animal gains will not be reduced in a silvopasture versus a treeless pasture. In a few cases, actually, animal weight gains tend to be improved, but it's in general, I would say, and there's some of the few work that has been done this on animal comfort against behavior from Dr. Pike in Virginia. Those animals may be gaining the same weight more comfortably, right? But there are other types of measurements that I don't know that have been captured, and maybe you can think about this in your operation. You know, number of days that the cows are open. Suddenly, you have to service those animals, inseminate them 2-3 times now, as opposed to one time if they had access to a silvopasture, right? Those types of measurements are not easy to collect, you know, but those are things to keep in mind in terms of the costs, right? The number of days that the cows are open, number of services or reservices that you have to give to an animal. This is much easily captured in dairy, right? But we don't have a lot of dairy grazing in silvopastures because we see the milk in the bucket on the afternoon. In half a day, we see the effect of the stress on the livestock. But those are some of the other measurements that I think are critical. I think they add up. I don't think that we have quite captured them in detail as we would like. Usually we tend to think about animal weight gain as our first measurement. So wanted to point that out to the group.
Absolutely.
Well, so I think it goes back to that issue of carrying capacity, which Alton talked about, right? I'm going to agree with you, Miguel, that gain is usually, we actually sometimes see higher gains. And if we see lower gains, it's because we were way off in terms of stocking rate relative to the available forage. There are a few things in the chat. Wade was telling me that forest land in his part of the world is hard to come by. You come to Virginia, Wade, we've got a bit of it that's available in Central Virginia. And then there was another question about operations where tree components free fruit or nut. Yeah, so I mean, this is not uncommon under things like pecans, which Janet touched on. And I was going to yield the floor to Janet about the somatic embryogenesis question that came up earlier.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so when people are selecting the tree seedling source, there's a lot of information now. A lot of our genetic improvement was done by forest industry, and as those industries kind of started getting sold off, a lot of that research now has been bought up by private companies like Arborgen and these different companies. So we have more availability in seedling selection than we did as private landowners in the past. So we have open pollinated seedlings, which is where, you know, there's trees grown in orchards. We don't know where the pollen comes from, but we at least know one parent. That's kind of your lowest value, quality and price seedling. Those, you know, here in South Carolina, you can get 1,000 of them for $60, $65. Then we have control mass pollinated, where they cover the cones and they actually put the pollen directly on the cone. So those are kind of the next step up, and those are usually 3 to 4 times what the cost of open pollinated seedlings. And then we have clones, which were really being pushed for a while, but even like Arborgen now is backed off selling clones. And that's where each seedling is the exact same. They're duplicated in the lab. So when you buy those trees, every single one of those trees is exactly the same. They are very expensive, probably 9 or 10 times the amount of open pollinated. So, but there are, with the Tree Improvement Co-op out of NC State, they have what's called a PRS sheet, and it looks at the performance, the rust resistance, and then the stem quality of those seedlings. So that's a good source of information if you know you're more concerned about straighter stems, lower limbs, that type thing. So you can look at those data sheets and compare what families are available for purchase. So you don't always necessarily have to buy the most expensive seedling on the market to get good growth. A lot of it's going to depend on how you're managing it. You know, if you're doing silvopasture, you might have to prune if you buy some of those cheaper seedlings, but you know, but you can, like Alton said, you're growing your timber also, so you've got to keep in mind what are the markets in your area. You know, the low country right now, with the closure of the mill in Charleston, you know, people were getting almost half of what they were a year or so ago for their pulpwood. So, you know, you got to, it's economics. So, you know, think about what your potential timber is going to generate for you, in addition to your use of it for livestock. But, you know, you've got to weigh those costs for selecting those seedlings up front.
Absolutely. Any final considerations? We might be able to get like if anybody wants to unmute and ask one last question as well. We are open to this. We're about to wrap up. No questions from the audience.
I have one question.
Okay, go ahead, Lydia.
Yeah, I guess this question is building off of what Miguel has talked about before, but just a comment on the profitability. Maybe you could talk a little bit about if you have had or see any examples of if certain types of cattle are more profitable based on their adaptations to the Southeast, such as like the piney woods cattle that can thrive in the longleaf ecosystems, and if they are more profitable or if it's hard to kind of discern their the impact that the ecosystem has on their beef production.
So maybe I just make a comment and I'll for others please to follow. You know, there's that sleek gene type of livestock that there's some work around that in the sense that those type of animals are do not suffer as much during of heat stress compared to others. There's also, you know, the color of the livestock, right? There's that literature in there that, you know, some animals tend to suffer more than others. We have observed that in the field as an anecdotal. We haven't captured that in our system here in North Carolina. Some of our work in Peru, then it just changes completely from Bos taurus to Bos indicus. Then it's more Brahman type livestock. And so that, I in the context of silvopastures, I'm not sure that I have seen, but it's just me. Maybe I have not seen literature comparing different animal genetics. Maybe others can.
Okay, thank you.
The only thing I've seen is some kind of report somewhere that Shropshire sheep don't eat trees, you know, or some kind of something like that, that they're less likely as a breed to chew on trees. I have no clue if that's really true. And my sense is you can train an animal to eat almost anything. So I wouldn't trust that per se. Yeah, but from a production standpoint, Lydia, no, I haven't seen that kind of breed comparison.
Yeah, I've never seen as well, Lydia, anything. Whereas here in Brazil, same way like that Miguel mentioned in Peru. And one thing that we do need to always think about is like, what is the market for that specific breed locally as well before getting a different breed, because sometimes you might not necessarily have a local market for that. You might need to stick with the other ones that you would be able to use. So there are some questions popping up here on the chat. I'll try to get to them, and then we're gonna adjourn. So
maybe Liliane, if I just can add maybe
sure.
sort of a wild topic there, just following the question. And also because Alton did mention this about he's being able to see a couple of weeks more of grazing in the silvopasture. I have seen some literature coming from Europe where they have been planting annual crops in between alley cropping of silvopastures, and they've actually looked at the yield of those annual crops. And it does seem like they're in their setup, there's sort of an environmental microclimate thing that tends to help those annual crop wheat yields mainly. In that type of, that wouldn't be a silvopasture, right? Because there's no animal component there, but there's the trees in there and there's the land. So I just wanted to add that because Alton did mention he does see a couple of weeks more of grazing in the silvopasture versus the open land. Sorry, thank you.
Oh, no problem. So somebody's saying they are located on a coastal low country and have 10 acres of mixed hardwood. This person has dairy goats, so they are trying to increase forage areas not on their property. Is it worth to invest in a perimeter fencing to develop a silvopasture system?
So let me, I guess one of the questions would be, what's in that understory? And you know, how critical is it? So I had a student that had some silvopastures. He was reclaiming invaded pine plantation, and he worked with different goat breeds and sheep breeds, and he was most well, within the sheep, I guess, really, even he was most successful with Katahdin. For his goats, I don't remember the specific breeds, but those goats that had more dairy genetics were less likely to spend time cleaning up invasive species in the understory. Now, again, a lot of that is learned behavior, and it's passed from mother on down. So it kind of depends on how you want to go about managing that. And you know, how much you think you can get out of it. But my tendency would be to say yes. You know, goats would appreciate that kind of environment, even if they only had access to, you know, a woods or part of that woods, in addition to, say, some open fields, so that they could get in and get respite from the heat in your part of the world. One observation from probably one of our best silvopastoralists, he said, I was a cattle farmer, then I was a grass farmer. He said, now I recognize that I'm a tree farmer, and it's supporting everything else that's underneath it, or the trees are supporting everything else underneath it. So it's going back to Alton, it takes a change in mindset. And so, you know, my sense would be maybe take a half an acre or an acre and explore it a little bit. And if it's free, if it seems like that's something you want to push, go ahead and expand. If you say, I don't have the time or the energy or the desire, then you haven't wasted too much.
Absolutely. So just to wrap up, Jacob is asking, is there a recommended amount of sunlight to reach the ground? And then he mentions a resource for native warm season grasses from the National Bob White and Grassland Initiative.
Well, don't everybody jump in at once. Cool season grasses, we would typically say, well, so think about this in two different ways. The cool season species like orchard grass, fescue, red clover, white clover, at the leaf level, if just had an individual leaf, they'd be light saturated at about 50% full sun. When you put them in a canopy with lots of leaves, there's some shading there. So we think about, you know, more like light saturation at about 60% full sun. And so what that means is I'll get kind of same level of productivity if I only have 50 or if I have 60% of the sunlight that I would get in an open field. Now, warm season grasses, they're going to need more light, and that's going to change how you maybe want to arrange the tree configuration when you're planting. There is some variation within varieties and among species for all of this. So there's, you know, that comes into play. The other side of this, Miguel talked about, you're not losing animal productivity. What we see, you know, sometimes even when we have lower forage productivity, you know, because of the energy benefits for animals to be in a more comfortable environment and lying down more, that sort of thing, even when we lose a little bit of forage production, they maintain high degrees of productivity. So long story short, I would shoot for 60% full sun probably if I were managing cool season understory, maybe a little bit more light, or certainly a little bit more light, maybe 70% full sun through linear arrangements, north-south kind of orientation to get more light in there for warm season grasses.
I don't know if Miguel want to jump in as well, but John, I've been reading a lot about using native warm season grasses in silvopastures because Lydia Haller and I are working on a project together that we're going to be incentivizing this year. And that's exactly what I found, like 60% is the recommended, the recommendation I found. So I don't know, Miguel, do you have any thoughts that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I guess it's gonna depend too, because depending how the trees are planted, you're not gonna get 60% day long,
Sure.
right? And so that's and then also the type of tree. If you have a deciduous trees, and that also changes because they drop the leaves. So, but in generally, I would say those cool season grasses, fescue, which is important to our region of the world, grows much better under more shade than those natives. If you want those natives, try to maximize the amount of sunlight they get. And then, depending how the trees are planted, the design is in the field, and how the sun moves, you may not get sunlight day long, but you may get it enough for some times of the day, not to affect productivity. We actually measure that in our silvopasture here, forage productivity as a function to the distance of the tree, right? And at least for the first 3 years, we didn't necessarily see differences, but that's again our system, our type of system. So
sure. So we are going to be adjourning now. So if anybody has like some final considerations, I welcome them from the table, from the round table, sorry, everybody that's participating. Yeah, so Dr. Castillo is sharing some resources. I know Dr. Fike has some resources as well from Virginia Tech, and even some videos that they did on producers' experiences. So at this moment, I would like to thank you, everybody from the all the members from the roundtable, and also everybody else who is participating today. I see some questions on the chat. I invite you to reach out directly to us now so we can discuss those further. And we're going to be sharing some contacts so you can reach out to us later about those. We did have a really productive conversation today, so I appreciate everybody that contributed to that. And just some quick reminders now. So Janet shared some links for a couple of surveys, and then an invitation for the field day that we're going to be having on Mr. Smith's farm on April 11th. So I'd like to invite you all in South Carolina to try to come to the field day with us. It's going to be a good time to see what Alton has been working there, and also talk a little further and learn a little more about his experience there. And we, like I mentioned, Dr. Haller and I have a ongoing NRCS grant that we're going to be establishing Silvopasture Systems in a few producers' farms. So we are looking for one more collaborator. So if you are in South Carolina and you're interested in establishing some silvopastures, please reach out to me. So I can talk with you more about that project. It's a research project, on-farm research project. So we will just discuss a little further with you. So again, thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate your time and your support today, your help. So I hope to see you soon. And you're going to be receiving an email tomorrow from Janet with the recording, some more information as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.